Hi. Last time I spoke about the emerging divides between North and South, and I began that lecture with an overview of American economic growth in the first decades after independence. I ended by discussing the South as, possibly, still a colonial economy, growing raw materials for export to be manufactured elsewhere. I also argued that both Northerners and Southerners had good reasons to want to move into new territories in the West. For the South, it was the profits of opening up new lands to grow cotton on plantations using slaves. And for the North, it was the demographic pressure of too many people wanting to own their own farms. This was a very old issue, stretching back to the original colonies, when the engrossment of good land along the Chesapeake pushed people out of the rivers to start new farms. It was partly this movement of Americans into Western territories that fueled the French and Indian War, which drove the French from the continent and made Britain eager to tax her colonists to pay the costs of war. But after independence, westward expansion accelerated. Actually, I would argue that expansion was not intended to be westward, it just happened that way. When I read the papers left behind by Southern planters, they had their eyes on the Caribbean and Mexico as much as the region that became the American West. They achieved some of their dreams, but not all of them. They didn't get all of Mexico, but they got Texas. And so, even if they had dreams to spread out in every direction, they ended up going west. Likewise, New Englanders were thinking about Canada as a place to expand. They even invaded Canada during the War of 1812 and again in 1839. Conflicts over the northern border were extant throughout the long 19th century. We'll see them again as the Civil War draws near. The Yankees were eager to expand their settlements wherever they could, but they ended up going west. So, westward expansion was the result, and it made the divide between the North and the South worse. That's what I'm arguing today. Westward expansion in the 19th century was so active that it even acquired a name. It was called Manifest Destiny. This was a phrase that was developed by John O'Sullivan in 1839 to describe how natural it was to him that America should expand. Manifest destiny was an ideology and an ideal. It means, well, destiny means fate, and manifest means obvious or apparent. So the phrase manifest destiny referred to O'Sullivan's belief that it was obvious that Americans were fated to spread across the continent. It was a popular term and an ideology that justified westward expansion. Manifest Destiny was also the title of a painting by John Gast, completed in 1872. Here it is. You can see that it conveys an image in which settlers move from east to west. Here you can see the Native Americans being pushed out of the frame of the painting, and wild animals, all chased by settlers carrying pickaxes. And behind them are settlers building farms, with fences and oxen to pull their plows, and houses with chimneys. This is a painter that views these various stages of settlement as progress. Likewise, in the middle of the painting, we see a story of transportation revolution. Here, the natives are followed by covered wagons. We'll encounter these again when we talk about the Overland Trail, which are followed by a stagecoach. And behind that, trains and railroads, far, far in the distance. You can see a sketch of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was just then being built. And on the other side of the painting, the mountains of the West, to which all these advantages were coming. And Manifest Destiny is the name of this allegorical figure, this woman floating above the whole scene. We're Americans and Puritans, so she's covered up. But with a star at her forehead, she uncoils from her arms, down below to the railroads. Can you see what this is? It's a telegraph wire. So, Manifest Destiny floated above westward expansion and the technologies and transportation links that made it possible. Here's the thing. This was more than an allegory. This was really happening. Watch this GIF, which traces the outlines of counties as population moved into the West. One more time. The textbook tells you about the admission of new states in the decade after the Revolutionary War. This map shows you that Kentucky advanced from a territory to a state in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796, and Vermont up here in New England in 1791. Westward expansion was happening in both the South and the North. To this list, I would add my own home state of Ohio, admitted in 1803. While the rest of these states entered in the 18-teens. All these had been territories during the colonial period, and the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the land belonging to the United States and set off a wave of territory building, government construction, and statehood, which contributed to the coming of the Civil War. The admission of these new states was made possible by the movement of new settlers into the West. For example, 70,000 settlers poured west from Virginia in the years after independence, and they settled in Kentucky and took the steps to make it a state by 1792. These maps mark areas that had been settled by settlers, meaning not natives, but incoming migrants, both free and slave. These are settled territories in the 1800 to 1820 period. This map shows settlements between 1820 and 1835, and this last one carries us up to 1850. This population movement accompanied the acquisition of land that we see so clearly in the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase also reflects another example of the first theme this class uses, the relationship between ideals and economics. Because we know Jefferson was associated with the Anti-Federalists, and then was nominated as a presidential candidate by the Democrat-Republicans. During that 1800 campaign, he was caricatured as trying to pull down the power of the federal government. But once in office, he doubled the size of the United States and increased both the power and the bureaucracy of the federal government. He did it because it was there, because the Napoleonic Wars had returned the territory to France, and because the Haitian Revolution had undermined France's interest in maintaining a new world empire. He had no authority in the Constitution to do so, but he sent ministers to France and arranged the purchase of territory that was unexplored and undetermined. He bought 828,000 square miles, 530 million acres at 3 cents each. His ideals differed from his economics, and as he himself said, the less we say about the constitutional difficulties, the better. By that point, people were moving into the West and wanted to ship their farm produce and whiskey and other goods down the Mississippi, store and sell them in New Orleans for sale to the rest of the world. When Jefferson bought Louisiana, he made that possible. But he also lit a fuse that would result in civil war. The Louisiana Purchase is an example of westward expansion that put the political system of the Constitution under strain, leading to civil war. Here's how it happened. It's time to talk about statehood and representation, and the political dimension of the coming of the Civil War. I've talked about the economics and the emerging sectional divisions between North and South. I've set the stage for the politics by explaining the first-party system and the presidency of Jefferson. Now, with the Louisiana Purchase, we begin to see the political system strain. We see more land, more people, more states. By 1800, there were 16 states, the original 13 colonies plus Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Then, with the Louisiana Purchase, more states began entering the Union. Ohio in 1803, Louisiana in 1812, Indiana, 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and then Alabama in 1819. To the bill calling for Alabama's statehood, the U.S. Representative James Talmadge of New York attached an amendment prohibiting slavery in the state. It passed the House but failed in the Senate, but this amendment had made the issue of slavery associated with the admission of new states. The North had gradually abandoned the institution over the years and was still, in 1819, in the process of enacting measures to abolish slavery, free existing slaves, and forbid the institution, and calling for the prohibition of the institution in the admission of a new state like Alabama made it a question of whether a state would be a slave state or a free state. Alabama entered as a slave state, a state that permits slavery and has the laws to enforce it, laws concerning human property and the rights accruing to its owners. With Alabama's admission to the Union in 1819 as a slave state, there was a balance in the Senate. There were 22 states, an even number. 11 of these states were states that abolished slavery, and the other 11 supported slavery. With 2 senators from each state, there was balance in the Senate. Half represented free states, and half represented slave states. In 1820, Maine made a bid to enter the Union as a free state, a state without the laws that supported slavery. Remember that Maine had been kind of the wilderness of Massachusetts in the colonial period. But in the first decades of the 19th century, enough people moved up there to qualify as a state. But to admit Maine as a state would be to throw off the balance in the Senate. There would be 1 more free state than slave states, and 2 more senators, and Southerners objected to the possibility that the majority might overrule them. What was to be done? Henry Clay brokered a compromise, which became known as the Compromise of 1820. Clay was a senator from Kentucky, which at that point was a western state, and so somewhat removed from the north-south divide that characterized older settlements. Henry Clay realized that the territory of Missouri had enough population at this point to seek entry into the Union as a state, and he arranged that Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, one that permitted slavery within its borders, to balance the admission of Maine as a free state. In an effort to make this compromise last longer, the deal also premised that new states admitted above the line of 3630 would all prohibit slavery, with the exception of Missouri, which stood above that line. This compromise promised to adjudicate the issue for incoming states, as well as keeping the balance between free and slave states that was threatened by Missouri statehood. It was called the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and Henry Clay was responsible for it. The Compromise of 1820 worked for a while, but its necessity indicated that the problem was getting worse, that slavery in the South was beginning to affect the whole national government, that the slave owners who had received excess representation through the 3/5 clause of the Constitution now sought to maintain equal power in the Senate, and anything that threatened that power, even the self-determination of new states to keep their labor systems free, had to be manipulated away. The stress was showing. As Thomas Jefferson said of the Missouri Compromise, this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. The conflict between free states and slave states was now out in the open. In the path to civil war, the Louisiana Purchase, Westward Expansion, and the Missouri Compromise are key moments in the coming of the Civil War. Your interpretation of these events should support your claims about the coming of the Civil War, our overarching question for this class. Thanks.